Imagine being locked in a cold, damp dungeon, the air thick with dread. You hear a faint scratching, then feel tiny claws scurrying across your skin. In the darkness, rats hungry and desperate are unleashed as tools of torture. This isn't fiction. This was the grim fate of a French noble in the 14th century, whose ambition led to a horrifying end. Want to know how power, betrayal, and rats brought down a mighty lord? Let's dive into this chilling tale. Hey there, history lovers. Welcome to a story that's as gripping as it is gruesome. Today, we're stepping back into 14th century France, a time of castles, knights, and cutthroat politics. Our tale begins with a nobleman, let's call him Lord Guillaume, man whose ambitions soared higher than the turrets of his castle. To understand his downfall, we need to first see how he climbed to power. So, grab a seat, maybe a snack, and let's unravel the world that shaped this doomed lord in the 1300s. France was a patchwork of feuding lords, each vying for favor with the king. Guillaume was born into a wealthy family in the region of Aquitaine, a land of rolling vineyards and fortified manors. He wasn't just any noble, he was cunning, charismatic, and fiercely determined to rise above his peers. By his early 20s, he'd already secured a place at the royal court, rubbing elbows with dukes and advisors. How did he do it? Well, Guillaume had a knack for alliances. He married strategically, linking his family to powerful clans. And he wasn't above bribing officials to gain the king's ear. Think of him as a medieval networker, always one step ahead in the Game of Thrones. Well, almost. But life in the 14th century wasn't all banquets and tournaments. The 100 Years' War was brewing, and tensions between France and England were like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Guillaume saw opportunity in the chaos. He funded armies, lent money to the crown, and even led troops in skirmishes against rival lords. His castle became a hub of influence, where knights swore loyalty and merchants begged for his patronage. Yet, every step up the ladder made enemies. Rivals whispered of his ruthless deals, and even the king grew wary of his growing power. By 1340, Guillaume was a force to be reckoned with. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. So, what's next? Guillaume's ambition was about to collide with a dangerous web of betrayal. In our next chapter, we'll explore the schemes that set the stage for his gruesome fate. Stick around, because this story only gets darker. If you're hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild tales from history. Let's keep going. Lord Guillaume's castle is buzzing with feasts and flattery, but beneath the surface, a storm is brewing. In 14th century France, trust was as rare as a peaceful day, and Guillaume's rise to power had painted a target on his back. Let's dive into the schemes and rivalries that started to unravel his world, setting the stage for a betrayal so brutal it would echo through history. Ready for some medieval backstabbing? Let's go. Guillaume's success didn't just earn him admirers, bred enemies. Other nobles envied his influence, especially a rival lord, Bertrand, who controlled lands nearby. Bertrand was everything Guillaume wasn't: hot-headed, reckless, but dangerously cunning. The two had clashed over territory before, but by 1342, their feud turned personal. Guillaume had outmaneuvered Bertrand for a key position in the king's council, a move that cost Bertrand prestige and gold. Whispered rumors say Bertrand vowed revenge, swearing Guillaume would pay in blood. Meanwhile, Guillaume's own allies weren't as loyal as he thought. His right-hand man, Pierre, a knight who'd fought beside him for years, was growing restless. peer felt underappreciated, always in Guillaume's shadow, and whispers of discontent reached the wrong ears. The real trouble began when Guillaume pushed his luck too far. He brokered a secret deal to support an English lord during a tense moment in the 100 Years' War, hoping to gain favor if England gained ground. It was a risky move, borderline treasonous. Word of this deal leaked, likely through Peer, who saw a chance to climb by bringing Guillaume down. The king's spies caught wind, and suddenly Guillaume's name was tainted with suspicion. Bertrand seized the moment, spreading lies that Guillaume was plotting against the crown. By 1343, the royal court was buzzing with accusations, and Guillaume's enemies closed in like wolves. He didn't know it yet, but his castle walls couldn't protect him from what was coming. What happens when a noble's allies turn against him and the king's patience runs dry? In the next chapter, we'll see how Guillaume's world crumbles as he's dragged into a nightmare of justice and vengeance. Keep watching, this story's about to take a grim turn. If you're gripped, smash that like button and subscribe to stay in the loop. Guillaume's world was unraveling fast. By 1343, whispers of his secret deal with the English had reached the French king, Philip V, and the court was a viper's nest of accusations. The noble who once dined at the king's table now faced a royal summons that felt more like a death sentence. Let's dive into how Guillaume's ambition led him straight into the king's crosshairs, where justice in medieval France was as merciless as it was swift. King Philip was no fool. The 100 Years' War had stretched his resources thin, and he couldn't afford disloyalty from his nobles. Guillaume's rumoured ties to the English were a spark in a kingdom already on edge. Bertrand, his rival, fanned the flames. Presenting forged letters likely with Peers helped that painted Guillaume as a traitor plotting to hand Aquitaine to the enemy. These letters, though flimsy, were enough to enrage the king. In a candlelit chamber, Philip declared Guillaume's actions a betrayal of the crown. By spring, royal guards stormed Guillaume's castle, dragging him from his hall in chains. His wife and children could only watch as he was hauled to Paris for trial. Medieval trials weren't about fairness. They were about power. Guillaume faced a council of nobles, many of whom he'd outsmarted or offended over the years. His pleas of loyalty fell on deaf ears. The king, eager to make an example, sentenced him to imprisonment in the notorious Châtelet, a fortress turned prison in Paris. This wasn't just a cell, it was a place where hope went to die. Guillaume, once clad in fine silks, now sat in a dank, rat-infested dungeon, unaware that those rats would soon play a starring role in his fate. His enemies, led by Bertrand, weren't done yet. They wanted him to suffer in ways unimaginable. What happens when a noble is thrown into a medieval prison with enemies baying for blood? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the chilling plot that turned Guillaume's punishment into a nightmare. Stay tuned, this gets darker. If you're hooked, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Guillaume's fall from grace was complete. Shackled and stripped of his titles, he was now a prisoner in the Châtelet, a grim fortress in the heart of Paris where the air reeked of despair and decay. The year was 1343, and the once mighty noble was about to face a punishment so horrific it would etch his name into the darkest corners of medieval history. Let's step into the shadows of his prison cell and uncover the sinister plot that turned his confinement into a living nightmare, where rats became instruments of terror. The Châtelet was no ordinary prison. Its stone walls, slick with moisture, housed thieves, traitors, and anyone who dared cross the crown. Guillaume's cell was a cramped, lightless hole, barely large enough for him to stand. The floor was a mix of straw and filth, and the only sounds were the moans of other prisoners and the constant scratching of rats. These creatures, drawn by scraps and waste, were everywhere bold, hungry, and unafraid, for a noble used to velvet, cushions and roaring fires. This was torture enough. But Guillem's enemies, particularly Bertrand, wanted more than discomfort. They wanted him broken, body and soul. Bertrand, who'd climbed the ranks by slandering Guillem, had the ear of the prison's warden, a cruel man named Hugues, known for his inventive punishments. Hugues had a reputation for turning imprisonment into spectacle. In the 14th century, torture wasn't just about justice. It was a message to others: defy the king and suffer. Guillem's supposed treason made him a perfect candidate for something unforgettable. Bertrand, fueled by years of resentment, allegedly met with Hugues in secret, plotting a punishment that would make Guillem's name synonymous with horror. The idea was simple but grotesque. Use the prison's rats not just as pests, but as weapons. Rats were plentiful, and their instincts could be manipulated. The plan was to trap Guillem in a way that would exploit his fear and pain, ensuring his suffering lingered in the minds of anyone who heard the tale. The setup was chillingly precise. Hugues ordered a special device, wooden box or cage, just big enough to hold Guillem's body, with openings designed to let rats in but not out. The guards would starve the rats for days, making them ravenous. Then they'd place them in the box with Guillem, their claws and teeth driven by hunger. This wasn't a quick execution. It was designed to prolong agony, to let fear and pain consume him. Historical accounts from the time, though sparse, suggest such methods were rare but not unheard of. Rats were cheap, effective, and terrifying. For Guillem, the man who once commanded armies, this was a humiliation beyond comprehension. His wealth, his alliances, his cunning all useless against the skittering horror that awaited. As the guards prepared this gruesome fate, Guillem sat in his cell, unaware of the specifics, but sensing the malice closing in. He'd heard screams from other parts of the chatelet, seen the hollow eyes of prisoners who'd endured Hugues' justice. His own pride kept him defiant, but cracks were forming. He wrote desperate letters to the king, begging for mercy, swearing his loyalty. But Philip VI, pressured by Bertrand and others, turned a blind eye. The court had moved on, and Guillem was no longer a player, just a cautionary tale. The rats, though, were ready, and the stage was set for a punishment that would push human endurance to its limits. What happens when a noble faces a torture designed to break both body and spirit? In the next chapter, we'll witness the moment Guillem's nightmare becomes reality, as the rats are unleashed. This story's about to get even more intense, so don't go anywhere. If you're gripped by this tale, smash that like button and subscribe to keep up with the rest of this chilling saga. Guillem's fate was sealed in the dank depths of the chatelet, where the air grew heavier with dread. By late 1343, the once proud noble was a shadow of himself, weakened by hunger and the relentless gloom of his cell. But his enemies weren't satisfied with mere imprisonment. Bertrand and the warden, Hugues, had crafted a punishment so vile it would haunt the annals of medieval cruelty. The rats, starved and ravenous, were about to take center stage in a torture that would test the limits of human endurance. Let's step into the heart of this nightmare and see how Guillem faced the horrors. Unleashed upon him, the day of the torture arrived without warning. Guards dragged Guillem from his cell, his wrists raw from iron shackles. He was taken to a lower chamber, a place even the other prisoners whispered about in fear. The room was small, its walls stained with mold, and in the center stood the wooden contraption. Hugus had prepared a narrow box, barely wider than a man's shoulders, with small, deliberate holes carved into its sides. Guillaume's heart must have pounded as he saw the glint in Hugo's eyes, a mix of cruelty and anticipation. The guards forced him into the box, binding his arms and legs so he couldn't move. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint scratching of claws echoed from nearby cages where the rats were kept. Hugus didn't rush. He wanted Guillaume to feel every moment of dread. The warden explained, in a cold, deliberate tone, what was coming. The rats, starved for days, would be released into the box. Driven by hunger, they'd claw and bite, seeking any sustenance. They could find Guillaume's, flesh included. This wasn't just physical torture. It was psychological warfare, designed to break his spirit before the first claw touched him. As the first rat was slipped through a hole, Guillaume's defiance crumbled. Historical accounts, though fragmented, describe men in similar tortures screaming before the pain even began, the terror of anticipation overwhelming them. Guillaume, proud as he was, likely clung to his noble resolve, but the skittering of tiny feet would have tested any man's courage. The rats were relentless. Their sharp teeth and claws tore at exposed skin, driven by instinct and desperation. The box amplified their frenzy, trapping them against Guillaume's body. Each bite was a jolt of agony, each scratch a reminder of his fall. The guards watched, some with grim fascination, others turning away from the brutality. Bertrand, though not present, had ensured the punishment was carried out to his specifications, a twisted revenge for years of humiliation. Guillaume's cries echoed through the chatelet, a sound that chilled even the hardest prisoners. In the 14th century, such tortures were rare, but not unknown. Rats were a cheap and effective tool, their natural behavior weaponized to horrific ends. Guillaume endured hours of this, his strength waning as blood and exhaustion took their toll. Yet, even in this hell, Guillaume's story wasn't over. The torture was meant to break him, not kill him outright. Hugus and Bertrand wanted him alive to suffer the shame. When the rats were finally removed, Guillaume was left trembling, his body a map of wounds, his mind teetering on the edge. He was returned to his cell, alive but shattered, a living warning to other nobles. The king, informed of the punishment, remained silent, his anger sated for now. But Guillaume's ordeal was far from the end. His enemies were still plotting, and the chatelet held more torments yet to come. How does a man survive such a nightmare? And what happens when his enemies demand even more? In the next chapter, we'll explore Guillaume's struggle to cling to hope in the face of relentless cruelty. This tale's not over yet, so stick around for the next twist, if you're caught up in this grim saga. Hit that like button and subscribe to keep following this haunting journey. Guillaume's body bore the scars of the rat torture, his skin torn and his spirit battered. But he was still alive in the grim depths of the chatelet in late 1343. The once mighty noble, who had commanded armies and swayed kings, now lay in a filthy cell, his world reduced to pain and darkness. Yet, even in this abyss, a flicker of defiance burned within him. His enemies, Bertrand, Hugus, and the Silent King, expected him to crumble. But Guillaume's story wasn't over. Let's dive into how he clung to hope and fought to survive in a place designed to destroy him. The days after the torture were a blur of agony. Guillaume's wounds festered in the damp, rat-infested cell. And the chatelet's meager ration, stale bread and murky water did little to restore his strength. Sleep was nearly impossible. The skittering of rats, now a constant trigger, kept him on edge. Yet Guillaume was no ordinary prisoner. He'd built his life on cunning, and even now he refused to let despair win. He began to whisper to other prisoners through the walls, trading stories for scraps of food or information. These connections, frail as they were, gave him purpose. He learned of guards who could be bribed, of weaknesses in the prison's routines. A plan, however faint, started to form in his mind: an escape, or at least a way to endure. Outside the chatelet, Guillaume's fate was still a topic of grim fascination. His family, though stripped of influence, sent petitions to the king, pleading for mercy. These went unanswered, as Philip VI was consumed by the 100 Years' War and saw Guillaume as a settled matter. Bertrand, meanwhile, revelled in his rival's downfall, spreading tales of the torture to humiliate Guillaume further. But not everyone was against him. A few old allies, loyal knights from his campaigns, began to whisper in taverns about rescuing their lord. These rumors reached Hugues, who tightened security around Guillaume's cell, fearing a rebellion. The warden, ever cruel, doubled down, ordering random beatings to keep Guillaume weak and submissive. Yet each blow seemed to stoke Guillaume's resolve, his pride refusing to let Bertrand have the final word. Guillaume's defiance took small but bold forms. He scratched messages into the cell walls, oaths of vengeance against Bertrand, prayers for his family. He refused to beg during Hugues inspections, meeting the warden's gaze with a glare that unnerved even the hardened man. These acts were dangerous. Other prisoners who defied Hugues often vanished, their screams fading into the night. But Guillaume's reputation as a noble, even in chains, gave him a strange kind of leverage. The guards, superstitious and wary of his past power, hesitated to push him too far. Still, Bertrand wasn't done. He pressed Hugues for another round of torture, determined to extinguish Guillaume's spirit entirely. The rats, it seemed, might return, and the thought hung over Guillaume like a storm cloud. As winter crept into 1343, Guillaume's body weakened, but his mind sharpened. He began to barter with a guard, offering secrets about hidden wealth in exchange for better treatment. Whether these promises were real or a desperate bluff, they bought him time. The chatelet was a place of despair, but it was also a place of cracks, corrupt guards, loose alliances, and fleeting chances. Guillaume's survival hinged on exploiting these, on staying one step ahead of his tormentors. But time was running out, and Bertrand's influence grew stronger, pushing for a final act to crush his rival for good. Can a broken man outwit a prison built to destroy him? In the next chapter, we'll see how Guillaume's desperate plans unfold, and whether his enemies will tighten their grip. This story's heating up, so don't miss what comes next. If you're gripped by Guillaume's fight, smash that like button and subscribe to stay with this chilling tale. Winter's chill seeped into the chatelet by late 1343, turning Guillaume's cell into a freezing tomb. His body, scarred from the rat torture and weakened by beatings, clung to life through sheer will. Yet, in the darkness, a spark of hope flickered, rumors of rescue and the faint possibility of escape. Guillaume, once a master of alliances, now pinned his survival on whispered deals and fragile loyalties. His enemies, led by Bertrand and the ruthless warden Hugues, were closing in for another blow, but Guillaume wasn't ready to surrender. Let's dive into the desperate schemes that fueled his fight to break free from the chatelet's grip. Guillaume's mind, though battered, was his sharpest weapon. He'd spent weeks building trust with a guard named Roland, a grizzled man who'd grown tired of Huga's cruelty. Roland wasn't loyal to Gigam, but he was greedy, and Gillam's promises of hidden gold, whether true or fabricated, his interest. Through hushed conversations during food deliveries, Guillaume offered details of a supposed stash in Aquitaine, enough to make Roland rich. In return, he asked for small favors, extra bread, a tattered blanket, and, most crucially, information about the prison's layout. Roland, wary but tempted, began to share snippets, guard schedules, weak points in the walls, and rumors of a tunnel used for smuggling supplies. These fragments were gold to Gigam, pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. Outside, the world hadn't forgotten him entirely. His wife, Lady Eleanor, worked tirelessly, selling jewelry to bribe courtiers and rally old allies. A handful of knights, loyal to Guillaume from his glory days, met in secret, plotting a daring rescue. They spread word in taverns, hoping to find sympathizers or mercenaries willing to storm the chatelet. These whispers reached Bertrand, who was now a trusted advisor to the king. Furious at the thought of Gigam slipping away, he doubled the guards around the prison and pressed Hugis to act. The warden, eager to please, devised a new torment to crush Gigalam's spirit before any rescue could materialize. The rats, it seemed, weren't done with Himzugas, planned a second session, this time with even less mercy. Gijam sensed the danger. The prison's mood had shifted. Guards were rougher, their eyes colder. Roland warned him of Huga's plans, hinting that the next torture would be fatal. This lit a fire under Gigam. Using a shard of stone, he scratched crude maps of the prison on his cell floor, piecing together Roland's tips. He learned of a drainage grate in a lower corridor, barely guarded at night, that might lead to the Seine River. It was a long shot, crawling through filth, evading patrols, and surviving the cold waters. But it was his only chance. He began, hoarding bits of food to build strength, whispering to other prisoners to create distractions when the time came. His defiance, once just pride, was now a calculated gamble for freedom. But the chatelet was a fortress, and escape was a dream that often ended in death. Bertrand's spies caught wind of the knight's plans, and a trap was set. One night, as Guillaume tested Roland's loyalty by asking for a loosened grate, Hugis appeared at his cell, his smile venomous. The warden knew of the escape plot, not all of it, but enough to tighten the noose. Guillaume's heart sank, but he didn't break. He'd faced rats and survived. He'd face this too. As Hugis taunted him with promises of more pain, Guillaume's mind raced, clinging to the hope that Roland or his knights might still come through. Will Guillaume's desperate plan unravel, or can he outwit a prison built to crush him? In the next chapter, we'll see the clash between his fading hope and his enemy's relentless cruelty. This tale's reaching a boiling point, so stick with it. If you're caught up in Guillaume's struggle, hit that like button and subscribe to catch the next twist. The winter of 1343 tightened its grip on the chatelet, where Gigam languished in his cell, his body frail but his mind alight with the faint hope of escape. The noble who once dined with kings was now a shadow, his flesh scarred from the rat torture, his strength sapped by hunger and cold. Yet the whispers of rescue from his loyal knights and his secret dealings with the guard Roland kept him fighting. Bertrand and the warden Hugis, sensing Guillaume's defiance, were ready to crush him with a second, even crueler torture. But Guillaume had one last gambiter, desperate bid for freedom that would test every ounce of his cunning and courage. Let's dive into the fateful night when Gilm's fate hung by a thread, and the chatelet became a battlefield of hope. And Betrayal, Gillam's plan was fragile, built on scraps of information and shaky trust. Roland, the greedy guard, had confirmed the drainage grate in a lower corridor could lead to the Seine River. But it was a treacherous path, filthy and guarded at unpredictable hours. Gijam had spent days preparing, hoarding bits of bread to bolster his strength and scratching a crude map into the dirt of his cell floor. He'd also enlisted 2 fellow prisoners, a thief named Mark and a disgraced soldier called Jean, promising them freedom if they helped. Their role was simple but risky: create a distraction by starting a fight in the upper cells, drawing guards away from the lower corridors. Guillaume knew the odds were slim. Hugues' spies were everywhere, and Bertrand's influence ensured the prison was on high alert after rumors of a rescue. As night fell, the chatelet grew eerily quiet, save for the distant clank of chains and the ever-present scratching of rats. Guillaume's heart pounded as he waited for Roland's signal, a single knock on his cell door. When it came, just past midnight, he felt a surge of adrenaline. Roland, risking his own neck, had loosened the grate earlier that day and left a small iron tool to pry it open. Guillaume slipped from his cell, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. The corridor was dim, lit only by flickering torches, and every shadow felt like a guard ready to pounce. He crept toward the lower level, his breath shallow, his wounds aching with every step. Above, he heard shouts. Mark and Jean had started their brawl, and the guards' heavy boots thundered toward the noise. The plan was working, but time was short. The drainage grate was exactly where Roland described, tucked in a corner behind a pile of rotting straw. It was rusted and heavy, but Guillaume's desperation gave him strength. He pried it open, wincing at the faint creak, and peered into the dark tunnel below. The stench of sewage was overwhelming, and the passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He hesitated, knowing the Seine's icy waters awaited, and a single misstep could mean drowning or recapture. But the thought of Hugues promised. Torture another round with the rats, this time meant to kill, pushed him forward. He slid into the tunnel, his body scraping against slimy walls, the darkness swallowing him whole. Meanwhile, outside the chatelet, Guillaume's knights had launched their own plan. Led by a loyal captain named Alling, a small band of 6 men, armed with swords and cloaked in darkness, approached the prison's outer walls. They'd bribed a local fisherman to guide them along the Seine, hoping to meet Guillaume if he emerged. But Bertrand's spies had been thorough. A trap waited. Royal soldiers, tipped off by a traitor among the knights, ambushed Elaine's group. A brief, brutal skirmish erupted, steel clashing under the moonlight. 2 knights fell, and Ailing was forced to retreat, his heart heavy with failure. Inside, Guillaume was unaware of this betrayal, crawling through the tunnel, his hands numb. From the cold, his hope pinned on reaching the river. Back in the chatelet, Hugues sensed something was amiss. The prisoner's fight was too convenient, and Roland's nervous glances hadn't gone unnoticed. The warden stormed to Guillaume's cell, finding it empty. Enraged, he ordered a full search, rousing every guard. The alarm bells rang as Guillaume reached the tunnel's end, where the grate opened to the Seine. He pushed with all his strength, but the grate held fast, rusted shut, or deliberately sealed. Panic surged as he heard boots above, guards closing in. With no time left, he wedged the iron tool into the grate, prying until his hands bled. The grate gave way just as torchlight flickered in the tunnel behind him. Guillaume plunged into the icy river, the current pulling him into the night. Did Gijam escape the chatelet's clutches? Or was this desperate leap his final act? In the next chapter, we'll uncover whether the Sane carried him to freedom or delivered him to a new kind of doom. This story's at its peak, so don't go anywhere. If you're gripped by Guillaume's fight, smash that like button and subscribe to see how this saga ends. Guillaume's plunge into the icy Seine was a gamble between life and death. The winter of 1343 had turned the river into a freezing torrent, and as he broke the surface, gasping for air, the current threatened to drag him under. Behind him, the chatelet's alarm bells echoed and torchlight flickered as guards scoured the banks. His body, weakened from torture and starvation, screamed in protest, but Guillaume's will to survive burned brighter than ever. The noble hood faced rats and betrayal now battled the river itself, clinging to the hope of freedom. Let's follow his desperate swim and uncover whether the Seine would be his savior or his grave. The water was a shock to his system, numbing his limbs within seconds. Guillaume's wounds, still raw from the rat torture, stung fiercely as the cold seeped into them. He fought to keep his head above water, his arms flailing against the current. The Seine was wide and treacherous, its banks lined with reeds and jagged rocks. In the darkness, he could barely see, relying on instinct to guide him downstream, away from the chatelet. His plan, fragile as it was, had been to reach a bend in the river where his knights, led by Alling, might be waiting with a boat. But the failed ambush on the banks had scattered his allies, and Guillaume was alone, a fugitive in a city that wanted him dead. Every stroke was agony. The weight of his soaked rags dragged him down, and his strength, already depleted, began to falter. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, and their children, their faces fueling his resolve. He couldn't let Bertrand win, couldn't let Hugo's cruelty be his end. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted a cluster of reeds near the bank and grabbed them, pulling himself into the shallows. Shivering and exhausted, he collapsed in the mud, his breath ragged. The distant shouts of guards told him he wasn't safe yet. He forced himself to move, crawling through the underbrush, his eyes scanning for any sign of Elaine's men. The fisherman who'd promised to help the knights was nowhere in sight either, fled or betrayed. As dawn crept over Paris, Guillaume found temporary refuge in a thicket, hidden by dense foliage. His body was near collapse, but his mind raced. He needed shelter, food, and a way out of the city. Paris was a maze of danger for a fugitive. Bertrand's spies and the king's soldiers were everywhere, and Guillaume's face was known. He tore strips from his tattered clothes to bind his wounds, using mud to mask the blood. By sheer luck, he stumbled upon a discarded cloak near a fisherman's hut, likely left by a careless worker. It was a small mercy, but it hid his features and offered some warmth. His next move was to find a sympathetic soul, someone who hadn't heard the tales of his treason or who hated Bertrand enough to help. Guillaume's years of alliances now became his lifeline. He recalled a merchant, Simon, who owed him a favor from a deal years ago. Simon lived on the city's edge, near the Port St. Denis, a place Guillaume could reach by staying off main roads. Moving at dusk, he limped through alleys, avoiding patrols and curious eyes. Hunger gnawed at him, and fever was setting in from his wounds, but he pressed on. When he reached Simon's house, he knocked weakly, praying the merchant's loyalty held. Simon, shocked to see the haggard noble, hesitated, but let him in, hiding him in a cellar. There, Guillaume ate his first real meal in week's bread, cheese, and watered wine while Simon whispered of the city's mood. Bertrand was furious, offering rewards for Guillaume's capture, and the king had declared him an outlaw. Simon's aid came with risks. He could shelter Guillaume for a night, maybe two, but no longer. The merchant spoke of a caravan leaving for Normandy, where Guillaume might find passage to safer lands. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had. As he rested in the cellar, Guillaume's thoughts turned to his knights. Had Aling survived the ambush? Could Eleanor still rally help? The Seine had spared him, but freedom was far from one, and Bertrand's reach was long. Will Guillaume slip through Paris net, or will his enemies drag him back to the Chatelet? In the next chapter, we'll see the final act of this harrowing tale as Guillaume faces his last chance at redemption. This story's racing to its end, so stay with it. If you're hooked on Guillaume's fight, hit that like button, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to catch the thrilling conclusion. Guillaume's escape from the Seine had bought him a fleeting chance at freedom. But by the winter of 1343, Paris was a hunter's trap closing round him. Hiding in the merchant Simon's cellar, his body ravaged by fever and wounds from the rat torture, the former noble clung to a fragile hope. Bertrand's spies scoured the city. The king's decree branded him an outlaw, and every step outside risked capture. Yet Guillaume's cunning and the loyalty of a few still burned bright. As he faced his last chance to slip away or fall back into the Chatelet's horrors, his story reached its climax. Let's dive into the final act of Guillaume's saga, where redemption, revenge, and fate collide. Simon's cellar was a cramped refuge, its walls damp and its air thick with the scent of wine and mould. Guillaume, wrapped in a stolen cloak, devoured what little food Simon could spare, his strength slowly returning. The merchant's news was grim. Bertrand had tripled the reward for Guillaume's capture, and soldiers patrolled every gate out of Paris. The caravan to Normandy, Simon's promised escape route, was leaving at dawn. But joining it meant crossing the city's heavily guarded northern quarter. Guillaume knew the odds were against him, but surrender wasn't in his blood. He spent the night plotting, his mind sharp despite his body's frailty. Simon, risking his own life, agreed to forge a letter of passage, claiming Guillaume was a merchant's servant fleeing the war as dawn broke. Guillaume disguised himself, his face smeared with ash to hide his noble features, his scars hidden under tattered robes. Simon led him through back alleys, avoiding the morning bustle of Paris markets. The city was alive with rumors of the escaped traitor, and every glance from a passerby felt like a blade. At the Port Saint-Denis, the caravan waited a ragtag group of traders and refugees, their wagons loaded with goods. Guillaume's heart raced as he approached the gate, where guards checked papers with suspicious eyes. Simon's forged letter held up, but a young soldier, perhaps tipped by spies, lingered too long on Guillaume's face. Just as the guard opened his mouth to call for help, a commotion erupted. A cloaked figure on horseback charged the gate, shouting and scattering the guards. It was Aling, Guillaume's loyal captain, who'd survived the failed ambush by the Seine, wounded but defiant. Aling had tracked Guillaume to Simon's house through a network of loyalists. His distraction gave Guillaume the moment he needed. Slipping into a wagon, he buried himself among sacks of grain as the caravan rolled out. The guards too distracted by Elaine's chaos to notice. Aling, however, paid dearly. Soldiers cut him down before he could flee, his sacrifice ensuring Guillaume's escape. As the wagon rumbled toward Normandy, Guillaume's heart was heavy with gratitude and guilt. He vowed to honor Elaine's loyalty, even if it meant living in exile. The journey to Normandy was grueling. Fever returned, and Guillem's wounds slowed his recovery. The caravan's leader, wary of harboring a fugitive, nearly turned him out, but Simon's gold and Guillaume's promise of future repayment kept him safe. By early 1344, he reached a small coastal village where a ship bound for Flanders offered passage. Guillaume, now a ghost of his former self, boarded under a false name, leaving France behind. Bertrand's spies lost his trail, and the king, distracted by war, let the matter fade. Eleanor, his wife, eventually joined him in exile, their children smuggled out by loyal retainers. They lived quietly, far from the courts and castles, their wealth gone but their bond unbroken. Bertrand, meanwhile, revelled in his victory, claiming Guillaume's lands and titles, but his triumph was short-lived. By 1346, the 100 Years' War turned against France at Crécy, and Bertrand's ambition made him enemies. Whispers of his role in Guillaume's torture soured his reputation, and he died in a skirmish, unmourned by many. Guillaume, in Flanders, heard of his rival's fate and felt a bitter satisfaction. The rats, the chatelet, the Seine they hadn't broken him. He lived out his days modestly, telling his story to a few trusted souls, a tale of betrayal, survival, and defiance that echoed through history. And that's the end of Guillaume's chilling saga, nobles rise, fall, and improbable. Escape from one of history's darkest tortures. What did you think of this wild ride through 14th century France? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you want more gritty historical tales like this. If you loved this story, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for sticking with us. See you in the next video.